The writer Albert Camus once said that in the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. It sounds almost sentimental, until you realise Camus was not writing for people who'd lost their luggage at the airport, but for those who'd lost their illusions about the entire universe. What he meant is that within each of us there's a hard, unstoppable core of iron, but only if we have the strength to call on it. And it didn't come from an Instagram influencer, but from a voice of the French resistance during World War II, someone who survived tuberculosis, who dodged the Gestapo, who campaigned against both fascism and Stalinism. He opposed both colonialism and the violence of some liberation movements, a position that gave him the rare honour of being despised by absolutely everyone. Although that didn't stop Camus from winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, but unlike Jean-Paul Sartre, he didn't turn down his award. Instead, Camus cut his own path through life, making it look easy and frankly cool. Despite refusing the title of philosopher, he might have a few tips on how to live and how to look cool doing it. He also gave us one of the most enduring philosophical images of all time, a man condemned to push a rock uphill forever, who we're told to imagine happy. So let's get into the philosophy of a rebel who refused to be a philosopher. And by the end of this video, you'll know why Camus thought that this rock and that so-called invincible summer might be the key to living well, even when nothing makes sense. Camus thought this might save your life, or at least make you harder to kill. So, who was Albert Camus? Well, he was born in 1913 in French Algeria and almost immediately lost all of the things we take for granted. His father was killed at the First Battle of the Marne when Camus was less than a year old. His mother was partially deaf, illiterate, and she worked as a cleaner. So childhood for Camus meant minimal conversation, it meant scarce money, and opportunity was always something other people had. He grew up in Belcourt, a working-class district of Algiers, in a cramped apartment with no electricity, no running water, and a view mostly of laundry lines and dust. Yet outside his front door was the Mediterranean, which became for Camus more than scenery. It proved that beauty could exist alongside poverty and that even joy could survive under hostile conditions. At 17, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which would flare up and periodically incapacitate him for the rest of his life. It ended his childhood dream of becoming a professional goalkeeper. Football, the purest form of the absurd. And it should have ended most of his other ambitions too. Instead, he threw himself into writing, into theatre, and into philosophy. By his 20s, he joined the anti-fascist left in Algeria, writing for the Alger Républicain, and he reported on famine and neglect in Kabylie with a clarity that embarrassed the colonial administration, and he developed the instincts that would define him: opposition to tyranny, suspicion of ideology, and solidarity with ordinary people. Enemies arrived on schedule. The authorities banned the paper. The local communists disliked his independence of mind, for example. In 1940, he left Algeria for France, and within a year, Nazi troops had occupied Paris, and later Camus joined the resistance. As an editor of the underground paper Combat, he wrote pieces that risked not just censorship, but execution. The Gestapo hunted journalists like him. The danger was constant. In a clandestine letters to a German friend, he argued that if the absurd forbids suicide, revolt must forbid murder, the first clear sketch of his ethics of limits during this time. After the liberation, he kept the same stance. He was one of the few public voices to condemn the atomic bombings in 1945. He opposed the execution of collaborators and later the death penalty at all in principle, a line he would sharpen in an essay called Reflections on the Guillotine. Fame followed him pretty fast. He wrote novels like The Stranger, The Plague, and an essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, which made him an essential public intellectual of the time. Intellectual feuds followed even faster, because this was France after all. His split with Jean-Paul Sartre over Stalinism became one of the most famous intellectual breakups of the century. In classic Camus fashion, he did not soften his position, even to keep his friends. And in classic Sartre fashion, he eventually abandoned Stalinism too, but he never reconciled with Camus. Sorry, didn't mean for that to rhyme. At the height of his career, Camus returned to the Algeria question. He opposed colonial rule, and he also refused to bless the FLN's terror campaign. In 1956, he even called for a civilian truce to spare non-combatants. In that moment, the quickest route to being hated by everyone was the one he walked without hesitation because he thought it was the one that was right. Throughout all of this, poverty, illness, war, and political exile, Camus didn't stop. More importantly, he didn't stop insisting that life's value isn't handed to you. You make it yourself, in full view of the absurd. So let's take a look at his major works. And those pressures didn't just shape Camus' life, they forged his books. Remarkably, each one of Camus' works comes at the same problem from a slightly different angle, and that problem is how to make a life in a world that withholds its reasons. So let's take a quick look at 5 of Camus' essential works over the span of his career. His first book, Nuptials, was a series of 4 essays. It was less of a manifesto, like some of his other works, more of a celebration of the Algeria he loves, like the moments that let the North African sun soak into his skin. It's a beautiful work. It's remarkable for such a young author, and in some ways it's the most at-home Camus ever sounds on the page. In it, he makes a decision that will guide the rest of his life. There is no appeal beyond this life, so learn to prize what is here without lying to yourself. It's Camus' farewell to religion and his embarkation on the existential journey that will define the rest of his career. He also treats the religious hope of an afterlife as a mistake that blinds you to the present. It's perhaps a page stolen from Nietzsche, but we'll forgive a young author. In its place, he trains attention to stones, to flesh, to sky, while keeping death in view. For Camus, this isn't a path to hedonism, but a discipline of lucidity. If you can stand there and observe without flinching, then even joy can survive in such hostile conditions. Everything that follows in his work stands on this ground. The second major work that we'll look at is his most enduring essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, where Camus names the thing that visits at 3 a.m. after too much doom scrolling, the absurd. Our hunger for meaning colliding with a universe that withholds its reasons. That, for him, is what the old story of Sisyphus expresses. A man condemned to push a boulder uphill forever while fully aware that it will always roll back. There's no clever escape hatch here, no metaphysical loophole, only the task and what we make of it from moment to moment. It sounds almost zen, but Camus isn't preaching serenity. He's insisting on lucidity and on revolt, on living without appeal and refusing consoling fictions while staying awake inside the work that you have to do. So Sisyphus has his rock, and we have the daily work of remaking meaning without guarantees. No God is going to step in and help us push. Understanding that, Camus says, is the beginning of freedom. It's the dropping an illusion that the world owes you a story and taking responsibility for that story on your own. And yes, there is happiness out there, not as a prize to be handed out at the summit, according to Camus, but as the strange clarity that comes when you stop bargaining with the mountain and start climbing anyway. As Camus famously remarks in the essay, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. The Stranger, or The Outsider in some translations, is arguably Camus' most famous work. In it, he turns what could have been a philosophical essay into an experiment in fiction. The protagonist, Mythsalt, is set adrift when his mother dies. He moves almost in a daze through the funeral, through a swim with Marie, through a sordid friendship with his brutal neighbour Raymond, and then a killing on a blinding beach where the heat feels like a physical argument. The novel is spare on motives and rich in weather. The sun is practically a witness for the prosecution. In the colonial setting, the victim is never named, it's just the Arab, a choice critics have rightly found troubling but is extremely powerful. At the trial, society asks Mythsalt for a moral story, for grief, for remorse, for redemption, and it gets none from him. Mythsalt admits the facts and refuses performance. The court treats a cigarette at the vigil and a cup of coffee as a metaphysical scandal. His real crime, it seems, is an indifference to the consoling fictions everyone else agrees to share. This is kind of Sisyphus from the inside. Mythsalt lives strictly in the present tense, the light, the heat, and the salt on the skin. He won't lie about what he feels to make the world comfortable. Condemned to death, he sees, quote, the benign indifference of the world and feels not uplift, but a fierce, lucid calm. The recognition isn't that life has meaning, but that it doesn't owe him one, and that he can still affirm it. It's also legible as a cautionary tale, Mythsalt as an anti-hero. Kierkegaard, who keeps coming up in these videos, I'm not sure why, might say that he's stranded in the aesthetic stage, living moment to moment, and Camus' own outlook might partly agree. It also contrasts with Camus' earlier work, where Sisyphus holds out the possibility of happiness and clarity, for example, but that happiness is much harder to find here. Our fourth work is Camus' 1947 novel The Plague, where the Algerian port city of Oran, then under French rule, shuts its gates and goes into citywide quarantine. It may sound hauntingly familiar. The book tracks a range of responses, but in the end it's less about what people do than the stance they take towards an unmovable reality. Some organise and help, some withdraw, some appeal to the mystery of God's plan. All of them confront a tragedy so large it stops meaning anything and starts becoming simply horror. There's no escape and no purely right approach. Camus circles something he calls common decency, doing the work that's in front of you with others within limits. If you want a philosophical gloss on this, you could say it's similar to Emmanuel Levinas's encounter with the face, an insistence on the other's dignity, but that comparison is mine, not Camus. The Plague widens Camus' Sisyphus stance from the solitary to the civic, and from an attitude to ethics. Clarity becomes solidarity. Revolt becomes care. And the measure of a life is whether you keep working and keep helping others while the world withholds its reasons. When the gates finally reopen, the character, Dr. Ryu, not the violinist, reminds us that the basilisk never dies. It waits. Finally, we have The Rebel. Published in 1951, this book-length essay turns Camus' solitary stance into a public ethic. It's a kind of hinge for Camus, moving from private lucidity to politics. Starting from the absurd, Camus asks whether revolt can ever justify murder, and he traces how rebellion slides into revolution and into terror, and he argues for measure, for limits, for proportion, for boundaries, instead of the kind of ends justify the means salvation stories and motivated reasoning. Camus defines revolt as a refusal of humiliation and lies that simultaneously affirms a shared human dignity. Revolt says no to degradation, and also no to the perfect future that excuses cruelty in the present. For Camus, no idea outranks a living person, because if your revolution needs purity speeches and coffins to prove a point, he's not buying. He also argues against laundering violence through a higher court, through God or through history or through the party, and instead argues for living without appeal, which means acting with others, within limits, and accepting responsibility for the means that you use. This is also where his friendship with Sartre breaks. Sartre reads history through Marxism. Camus will not. The split isn't about gossip. It's the practical edge of Camus' claim that ends which require contempt for the human are false ends. There's also a real resonance here with Simone de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity. It argued for a politics against oppression that still refuses absolutist justifications. Placed within the arc of his thought, the rebel widens the myth of Sisyphus and the plague. The sunlight of Camus' earlier works becomes lucidity, and then lucidity becomes solidarity. And here, solidarity is disciplined by limits. Living with others, without appeal, and within measure. It's also a book and an intellectual arc for Camus that makes me personally a little sad. Because while Camus was unlikely to ever reconcile with Jean-Paul Sartre, particularly given their respective temperaments, his thought practically screams out for a productive partnership with the work of that other half of the famous power couple, Simone de Beauvoir. But it was never to be. Because Camus refused the title of philosopher, he leaves us with something a little more useful than a system. He leaves us a way to practice his ideas. His novels and his essays are populated by people who try and fail and try again to live without illusions. Now, we won't walk their exact path, but the paths kind of rhyme, and the rhymes for all of us add up to a stance, kind of Camus' stance and approach. Just don't call it self-help. Instead, I think what we can get out of Camus is kind of 3 habits that you can train until they become almost a second nature. And the first of these habits concerns the absurd. Because for Camus, the absurd isn't a mood, it's a collision between our hunger for meaning and a world that withholds its reasons. The important step here isn't to despair about that collision, but to decide what to do once you have noticed it. Camus' own answer is lucidity. And he thinks that lucidity breaks down into 3 kind of ongoing practices. First, we must pay attention to what is here. And this is more than mindfulness by another name. It is the discipline of noticing the real, the light on the wall, the weather's small tyrannies, the fact of another person's presence. Attention keeps you anchored to a world that exists whether or not it flatters your story. Second, we have to keep death in view. Heidegger's being towards death translated into an everyday scale. And this is not a morbid hobby. It's a guard against procrastinating away your life. When endings are real, priorities get simpler. And third, we should refuse consoling fictions. In practice, that means stop bargaining for a story. You know, the quiet deals we try to make with reality, like if I endure this, then I'll be rewarded, or if we cut this corner now, history will forgive us later. If the lottery numbers land, I will become my best self on Monday. Camus cancels those contracts. There is no narrative warranty to cash in. Meaning isn't owed, it is made. And once you stop bargaining, you stop waiting for a cosmic plot twist, and you can act lucidly in a situation that you actually have. Now, none of this forbids joy. It simply changes the terms of that joy. Joy is no longer the prize promised at the end of a story. It becomes a byproduct of that clarity. The feeling that you're no longer mortgaging the present to pay for a hypothetical later. The terms and conditions still apply, chiefly death, but they no longer drown out your everyday. Then there's Revolt. And Revolt for Camus is not a riot. It's a standing refusal, a no to humiliation and to lies that at the same time affirms shared human dignity. In The Plague, that refusal looks like work. Rosters, sanitary squads, statistics kept by people who will never be famous. Revolt is not a posture against the world, it is a commitment to the world as it is, and to the people in front of you. And the unfashionable part of that revolt for Camus is that it has limits. The moment your cause requires other people to become raw material for your theory, it has stopped being revolt and started being domination in a new uniform. Camus pushes back against that drift by making solidarity practical. Grand gestures, particularly ideological ones, are tempting because they look like progress on camera. But stubborn work is better because it makes progress off camera. The effect is pretty modest by design. Revolt changes less than a slogan promises and more than cynicism will admit. It does not fix the world, but it keeps the world from getting worse while you're in it. If you need a metric, Camus offers a blunt one. After you act, are people more humiliated or less. In the end, Revolt is admittedly less fun than that guy in the Che Guevara t-shirt promised. Finally, there's living without appeal. And living without appeal means that there's no higher court to which you can outsource responsibility for your choices. No God to clean the ledger, for example, or no history to absolve your tactics. No party to turn the means magically pure. You answer to the day you are in and the people beside you. And that can kind of sound severe. In practice, though, I think for Camus, it's freeing, because he thinks that responsibility returns to the human scale and it becomes yours again. And for a man who refused to be called an existentialist as well, which is pretty much what an existentialist would do, it's a very existentialist point. From this, for Camus, follows measure. Limits, proportion, and boundaries. Measure for Camus is not timidity. It's an ethics that has learned the cost of dangerous rhetoric. In public life, it looks like opposing executions even when the crowd approves, or calling for a civilian truce even when both sides want purity, like refusing to write necessary next to the word collateral. In private life, it looks like resisting the urge to turn your virtue into theatre. So there's no informal performance reviews of other people's souls. This is also where I think Camus' biography and his ideas meet. It's there in the stance behind Reflections on the Guillotine, where he stood against the death penalty, or the refusal to celebrate the atomic bombings, or the calling for a truce in Algeria, which are all versions of the same Camus move. Act with others, within limits, and without appealing to a higher court to bless the means. It's not dramatic or virtue signalling, it's just honest. In short, for Camus, the absurd asks for lucidity, revolt asks for solidarity, and living without appeal asks for responsibility now, not later. So if you're interested in Camus, where is the best place to start? Well, firstly, I'd suggest a slightly unconventional entry point, and that would actually be his novel, The Plague. Although this is actually a really great everyman edition, which has a huge number of the essays and works that I've talked about in it, so it's worth getting. Although Folio Society, if you're listening, maybe some more Camus? For me, it's the clearest entry into Camus' philosophical approach, because it turns the private clarity of the myth of Sisyphus into public decency you can actually recognise. There are dilemmas and hard work and the unsexy but interesting choices that go into living an ordinary life in extraordinary times, which again sounds familiar. And if you're looking for a guide written by an expert, apart from us of course, then I'd suggest Robert Zaretsky's A Life Worth Living, Camus and the Quest for Meaning. You can even read the relevant chapters alongside the Camus works you're interested. Both are impressively short and to the point. Just like life, am I right? Zaretsky also does a great job of showing both the evolution of Camus' thought and the bright shining lines that thread their way throughout his work and his life. So that's a lot. We've attempted to cover Camus' major works in a pretty short space of time. We're even skipping one of my favourites, The Fall, which might make an appearance on our philosophical book club. We've looked at 3 big ideas from Camus and also how we might apply them in our everyday life. As I mentioned, a lot. And this is just a start with Camus. Hopefully I've given you a few tips on where to go from here if you're interested, because Camus is an incredibly rewarding writer and thinker to engage with. If there's more you'd like us to do on Camus, or books or works or ideas that you'd like us to engage with, then tell me down in the comics and we'll try and put some short videos out on them. But let's boil it all down, because what survives it all for me is simple and demanding. See what is really there, refuse humiliation and lies, act with others within limits, and take responsibility for the means you use. It won't explain the universe itself, but it might help us navigate our way through it together. Because for Camus, the boy who lived with silence, loving his mother, who struggled for breath through illness, who never ceased writing through war and oppression, that's how you live through the depths of winter, by carrying an invincible summer within. So until next time, be wise and be kind, and try not to start any major philosophical feuds.